This is TWiT.
Hey, I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of AdAster Magazine, and each week I join with my co-host to bring you This Week in Space, the latest and greatest news from the final frontier. We talk to NASA chiefs, space scientists, engineers, educators, and artists, and sometimes we just shoot the breeze over what's hot and what's not in space, books, and TV. And we do it all for you, our fellow true believers. So whether you're an armchair adventurer or waiting for your turn to grab a slot in Elon's Mars rocket, join us on This Week in Space and be part of the greatest adventure of all time.
Anyone who's been watching our shows, and in particular the last interview especially, knows that the whole Twitter Elon Musk shadow has been impossible to ignore. And one bit of respite for that news has been the surge in attention for Mastodon. And we have, by the way, our own instance, twit.social. So that's happening. That's what I signed up under anyways. It's seen a massive uptick in activity in recent months. But how's Mastodon doing with all of this new attention and all of this influx of people checking it out, kicking the tires, seeing if it's working for them? Joining us to discuss this is Amanda Hoover, staff writer at Wired.com. Amanda wrote the article, Mastodon is hurtling toward a tipping point. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. And again, I know we're right on the cusp of the holidays, so taking 15 minutes out of your day, we just totally appreciate you joining us. So first of all, talk a little bit about the kind of the fundamental differences between a social network like Twitter and Mastodon, whether they are similar or not. Right now, especially with everything happening with Twitter and people, checking out other services, they're being compared all over the place. Are they comparable? What are those differences?
They're comparable in that they're microblogging platforms. So people can go here and post very short messages. They can follow one another. They can reshare messages similar to retweeting, but they're very different in their construction. Unlike Twitter, which is a centralized platform now owned by the world's richest man who can make unilateral decisions, as we've seen, Mastodon is a decentralized open source platform. So it operates across many different servers. They're run by different volunteers who've wanted to start these servers. It's been around since about 2016, and it was pretty quiet, pretty niche, but it has really seen an explosion in users. They're up to about 2.5 million monthly active users as of the last week or so. That number could have even changed more recently, but yeah. That's a huge growth for a service like this. Twitter has hundreds of millions of users, but for this platform that a lot of people had never heard of, that's explosive in such a short amount of time.
And it's not just that there are a lot of users coming over. It's also about, this word that we're throwing around, these instances, like twit.social is an instance of Mastodon. It's just kind of how part of this open architecture works. So there, and when we look at that, then we realize that a company like Twitter, owned and operated by Elon Musk currently, a lot of that funding, the effort happens, and anything bad that happens falls on the shoulders of Elon Musk at the very top of that tree, of which there's been a lot. With Mastodon, you've got a lot of people operating these instances. So they're the ones, are they the ones that are footing the bill entirely and having to manage all of the really complicated stuff that a social network normally has to?
Pretty much. A lot of them do crowdfund. They have Patreons. They seek donations from their users to keep them going. And a lot of them have done that. But especially a lot of donations have gone up a lot as more people have used these, because running these servers isn't necessarily cheap. A person I spoke to for this article told me that he was spending about £100. He was in the UK. A month prior to the giant influx of users he's seen to keep the server online. And, he was happy to do that, maybe only getting a small portion of his costs covered by donations. Since his donations have gone up a lot more, they have more operating costs in the bank to keep going for a few months and maybe worry about that a little bit less. But with so many new users coming in, I've spoken to other instance runners and instance admins who have had to upgrade because the servers that they had were just crashing. They weren't enough to sustain the amount of activity that was suddenly happening, because it's not just the signups and getting through all of that. It's the amount of posts and activity increased so much every single day on these instances that have tens of thousands, some of them more than 100,000 users signed up now.
Right. That's a lot for a person who decides to spin up an instance, because, this is curious. I could do that. Suddenly you're faced with 100,000 users. It's a whole different story. Now, Eugene Rochko actually built Mastodon back in 2016. And if the cost to run an instance is actually footed by the person who launches it, as we're talking about, and not Eugene, not the people behind Mastodon, but the people who decide, hey, I want to spin up twit.social or whatever, what kind of impact do the creators of Mastodon, Eugene and others behind the company, actually have to encourage consistent, healthy growth of the platform when these things are kind of individualized?
Yeah, I think that they've been a little bit overwhelmed. I know that he was working 14-hour days, trying to make a ton of improvements, trying to keep things online. There is a nonprofit that he runs that kind of oversees some funding for Mastodon generally, or covers some of his costs. But it's been a huge lift for a lot of people. Mastodon is a small team, and then the instance runners, there are thousands of them, but a lot of them are working in small teams as well. So this network, what's so different about it, when you compare it to Twitter, Twitter's goal is to make money. They have advertising, they have investors, that has always been the goal of a platform like Twitter and so many other centralized social media platforms. Mastodon really seems to be a labor of love for so many people. They are very attached to their instances, to their communities there. They're really attached to the idea and very supportive of it. Everyone that I've spoken to that runs an instance really does it because they love it and they want that community feel. And they also want the on instances, they can control a lot more and moderate the content, so they can make rules that keep hate speech out and harassment. So a lot of people, I think, never thought it would grow to this point, and they're sort of all seeing how this shakes out.
I think you're bringing up the moderation aspect, and that's really top of mind for me, right? When I think of social networks and social media in general, not just Twitter, I'm also talking about Facebook and TikTok and all of them. We have read countless stories about the challenges, the difficulty, the amount of people required in order to successfully and properly moderate and keep these platforms safe, not just from hate speech, of course, but from CSAM, from child sexual exploitation material, things like this, the really hard stuff. So how is that done when we're looking at a federated instance by a random person who says, I'm going to start up my own instance, and then I have to imagine some of them are faced with these similar challenges that can be almost scarring to a certain degree for a lot of people who have had to moderate around them. Now it's just in the hands of anyone who decides to spin up an instance. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke to a few attorneys this week who really explained that you become more than a user when you start an instance. You're essentially becoming your own internet service provider, and you have to abide by the same kind of rules that exist for running a platform like Twitter. Copyright is a big one. Register, and it just takes a few minutes. They just have to register to be compliant under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Which it doesn't cost very much money. It doesn't take very much time, and they just have to agree to remove copyrighted material. But if someone neglects to do that, which a lot of people I think don't know that law very well because they've never had reason to be aware of it, if they weren't running something, they could be on the hook for lawsuits. It's the same. They have to follow rules about children 13 and younger signing up and collecting data. They have to, if they come across child sexual exploitation material, they are mandated to report that. So there are a lot of issues that come up that people just need to be aware of. Attorneys say, these aren't impossible for a small team to do. They just have to understand the laws around what they're working with. But they also, in addition to those were just US laws. If your server is available in other countries, you are liable to the regulations there as well. And that Europe has different rules, rules even can change state by state for certain things. So it is a bit daunting, but there are attorneys who are working in this space, who are hearing from people running instances, and it's possible to abide by all of these as a small instance.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I, again, I will just point to the fact that we have our own instance, so it's not like I'd have to go very far to ask how that goes. But it's very controlled, right? Leo Laporte has said many times on the shows, like, in order to get access to this instance, you got to let me know that you are a fan of the network, that you watch our shows, because he's not just letting anyone in, and that in itself has the opportunity to filter out a lot of what might come, in this kind of unmoderated space, that sort of thing. If someone is running an instance and all of this is just too much for them, say, that their user base is built up, they can't afford it, they don't want to deal with the headache anymore, and the instance goes away, like, what happens to all those users who open their accounts through that instance? That's a question that I've had for a while.
Yeah, it is possible to move your account from one instance to another if you download your data. You can start over. There's some directions on how to do that on Mastodon's website. Also, as well, when you're going to join Mastodon, and you go to their main page that has some instances listed, those are involved in an agreement. They've agreed to moderate for certain things, and they've also agreed to give 3 months notice if they're ever going to shut down the instance, which gives people more time to migrate. So some of those are the bigger ones that a lot of people have joined. And that's something that was in place prior to the big rush of people. It was a safeguard that was in there just based on the nature of the service. But we're seeing as well, concern that Twitter combusts and everyone's data is going to be gone and lost, and we'll lose this whole era of internet history and also world history that's really been documented on Twitter. So centralized platforms aren't necessarily, guaranteed to be around forever either. And Mastodon does have some safeguards in the idea that no one person can ever own it, and that it could be, continued on by those who still want to be involved.
Yeah. Well, I could say from my limited experience with it in the last, I'd say a couple of months at this point, is that it's been kind of a refreshing change. Like, yes, it's less total people, but the people that are there are very engaged, and things kind of stay on topic, and they don't get all squirrely the way I had gotten so adapted to Twitter just going in all of these directions that, like, I really didn't want to go. And I'm just not seeing that on Mastodon yet. Maybe that's a matter of this kind of like smaller, kind of more controlled, instance sort of approach. Maybe it's just the fact that there's less users. I hope it doesn't go there, but who the heck knows? But anyways, I'm having a lot of fun with there. Are you on Mastodon? If people want to follow you on Mastodon, can they find you?
I am. I'm at Amanda Hoover. You can find me there. I, just started. I'm building up my network. I started in November, but it's been a slower buildup, and I'm seeing more and more reporters or just other people that I know and sources, making their way over there over the past couple weeks.
Yeah, it's certainly happening quite a bit, especially like in the journalism and, podcasting circles and everything like that. For what that means, I don't know. But anyways, Amanda, thank you so much for carving out some time for us today. Amanda, of course, writes for Wired.com. You can search for Amanda Hoover there. And then, of course, you can find her on Mastodon, as she said. Thank you again. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.